Hi, I'm Pete, and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. Today is turnaround day on the Super C. It's finally time to start putting back together nice, clean parts. I've been busy in the last week or so collecting parts and getting things ready. I cleaned the transmission case here, took it outside, blasted it with pressure washer and degreaser, and then cleaned it off with a knotted wire brush on a grinder to get all the loose paint and grease off. So this case is ready to paint now after I get things back together. I did a similar job with the axle housings, degrease, grind off, ready to paint, cleaned up all the gear sets. Here's the other final drive parts. Everything's been cleaned up, ready to go. Here's the other side final drive parts, axles, everything. Cleaned up, degreased, got ready for paint. The torque tube, she's all nice and clean, inside and out now. And here's a load off my mind. I got the head back from Dave Richards, all wrapped in plastic here. He went through and redid it all, gave it the Cadillac treatments, got new valve springs, new valves, all cleaned up, ready to go. And down here's the crankshaft back from the crank grinding place. They ground it to 10 under. Looks beautiful. And I've been busy collecting all the parts that I think I'm gonna need. Dave got me a rebuild kit that's in this box. New sleeves, new pistons, new bearings, the whole 9 yards. I've got all the transmission bearing seals that I need. There's a new radiator back there. Went to Napa this morning and got a gallon paint, a gallon primer, all the assembly grease, gasket making material that I need. So the table's all set for me to just go to town reassembling this thing. And my plan of attack is we're going to start where we finished and put the transmission final drive, put the rear axles on, then build it forward, put the torque tube on, and then do the engine rebuilding, put that together so that I'll have the whole driveline chassis together, and then I'll paint that as one and start adding parts after that. For the most part, assembly is the reverse of disassembly, so we're going to start where we finished, just taking out this reverse idler gear, and we're going to put it back in. Got to get the hole lined up, put the bolt in. We have spinach. Feels good. Now we need to get the counter shaft ready, the lower shaft of the transmission. I've got all the parts cleaned and laid out here. The two bearings I checked out and they're fine. Actually, this one I could not locate a replacement for, so it's a good thing it's fine. And this one has a double row of ball bearings in it. This is the front bearing, and it's in awesome shape. There is absolutely no play in it. I'll bet this one would have cost me a lot of money. I didn't even check availability on that. So the first step is to put in this rear bearing, which has a separate inner race. Oil up the surfaces a little bit so things go together a little bit easier. And then this is a light friction fit. If I get it started, just there we go. Now we're going to save this outer part of the bearing and put that in the case because, as you remember, it came out a little difficult, so I'll have to put that in the case so I have a good way to push it in without the shaft being in the way. Step one of putting any bearing together for me is I give it some Lubriplate 105, which I call the fluffy engine assembly grease. It's good for putting in bearings. It dissolves away when you add the engine, or the engine transmission. What am I working on today? When you add the transmission gear oil, it'll dissolve away, but it gives the bearings a little bit of protection from grit getting into them. And you know, when you're test turning the transmission before you get everything back together, it just gives it a little lubrication. Now we're going to put this bearing in its bore, and it's a friction fit, so we want to get it started straight. And then I'm going to use my homemade bearing seating tool. You got to put it together here. It's just a socket that matches the size of the outer racer, is a little bit smaller. And then an extension. You know, you make do with what you have. We can give that inner race some grease here. Assembly lube. And slide that in. Next we can assemble the gears onto this shaft, and I have my little cheat sheet here from the parts manual that tells me which way everything goes on this shaft. So first we got a spacer. Put that on. And then we've got this gear. This is the oil slinger, which freewheels on here. There's a bushing on it, and I checked it, and it's fine. Slide that on. Well, you know, you gotta go back here. There we go. You just fit in there. You're a big guy. And then the next biggest gear, we know the snout, the long side of this faces forward from the parts book. That in. And then the medium gear, and again on that one, the snout faces forward. And then the smallest gear, and the snout on that one faces backward, the long side on it. I know it's a tight squeeze, but this is where you came from. You can come back. There you go. And one good way to check that you've got these gears oriented correctly is to look at the wear face. So the wear face on this one engages with the reverse idler here. You got two facing each other. Is that right? These shims are what control the backwards and forwards location of the pinion on the back of this in the differential. So very important. Put this guy on, bearing retainer and bearing. Get the shaft up in there. There we go. We'll tighten down this bearing retainer. Well, you're not the right size. I keep forgetting all the bolts and nuts on this tractor are 9/16. I should remember that. Now I gotta bump this shaft forward from the reverse side to get it to set in the bearing. And put this nut on. This shaft's thrust is controlled at the front here, held by the front. The rear bearing doesn't take any thrust, just the front one. I'm gonna tighten that a little bit for now. Make sure it's snug. We're on our way. Nice and smooth. You may have noticed that I didn't put the cover on this, and the reason is because I'm doing a test fit here for the differential, and I'll show you. That countershaft in the transmission has the pinion gear at the end of it for the differential, and you've got to get the pinion gear located correctly backwards and forwards, and you got to get the differential correctly located side to side, and check the mesh of the two before you do final assembly. You don't have to do that, but what I found on the MD is even though I kept track of the shims on everything and which side they went on, these are the cages for the differential bolt pinions. Even though I kept track of these shims, I had to switch them around to get the mesh right. So we're gonna test fit it so that I don't run the risk of damaging the new O-rings that I have to put in this to set it in. These O-rings aren't cheap, that's for sure. I was amazed. So we're going to put this together temporarily and then take it back apart and put the O-rings in for final assembly. But we want to check it first. Let's get these things on here oriented correctly. I didn't think I'd be so complicated here. And then you got to line up this hole. Does all line up? Well, that doesn't line up. Why are your holes so funny? Put a bolt in to keep everything aligned. I don't want to have to do that again. And then we got to make sure that this opening faces the bull gear, which is back here, because that's where the bull gear engages. There we go. Let's start the rest of these bolts and get them tightened down. We want everything to be in position here. You must be 9/16. Oh, you are. I'm learning my lesson. Now I have to assemble the differential. I took it apart to make sure everything was all right, and you know, it's pretty obvious things you're looking for. Scoring, worn shafts. This is the spider here. You know, you want to make sure everything is capiche in here. And there was nothing remarkable to look at. So now I got to grease it up and put it back together. Just put some lube on these. These gears should sit nice and tight in here with really no wiggle at all. And they do. Now to put this together, usually there's an alignment mark, and this is the alignment mark on this half because you want the two halves to go together the same way that they came apart. So you look for the alignment mark before you take it apart. Right there's the other alignment mark. There we go. I always take a photo of what these were before I tore it apart so I know which way the ring gear goes on. But you can see witness marks from the bolt heads here, so I know that the bolts go on this way. And then when we turn it around, the ring gear goes on this way. You just got to get everything lined up without hurting anything. Oh, get in there. The other reason I pulled this apart is because I replaced these tapered roller bearings that go on either side, and I had to put a bearing splitter behind to pull this off the shaft, so it had to come apart. These bearings had a little more wear than I would like on them, so I replaced both these and the outer races that go in bull pinion cages that are, I already put one in the engine. They were fairly reasonably priced, so it's good insurance. Just tighten this down. Now we got to put the differential together, and this takes a little finesse. This is called the bull pinion. The reason it's called the bull pinion is because it interfaces with the bull gear back here, that big huge gear, and the pinion gear is always the smaller gear of the two. So it's called the bull pinion, and this end actually goes into the differential. So we'll slide this in part way, and then you got to make sure you get the differential the right way. It goes in this way. Actually, it's marked on the cover left, right, so you can always double check that way. Kind of get everything set in here together. There we go. Nice click. That's what you like to hear. And then we can set this other pinion cage, because it holds the pinion in here. Get everything lined up right. There we go. Tighten it all down. So now that we got this in, it's time to check its play and how it runs. Now the first check is your side-to-side check. And since this has tapered roller bearings in it, it's different than the older ones that had ball bearings in them. The spec is just you should feel a slight drag when you turn it. And indeed, that's what I feel, is a slight drag. I know that's a feel thing, but it's kind of like tightening a wheel bearing on a car with the old cone bearings. Slight drag. Before we check backlash, I realized that I really don't have this lower shaft locked into place without this cap going on that seats on the outer flange of the bearing here to keep it from coming out this way. So we got to put this on. Okay, I've set up a dial indicator here, and you want to come off of the ring gear tooth and use a dial indicator to measure backlash. And I try to get it at a right angle to the tooth, tangent to the outside face of the gear, I guess, so you can get a correct reading. And this right here is what I mean by backlash. See how that gear has a little bit of play? The pinion's a small gear, the pinion against the ring gear. That's the backlash. Spec is 8 to 10 thousandths, and I'm getting anywhere between 17 and 19 or so. So we're going to have to do some adjustment. If I don't adjust it, then I'm going to get more of a howl out of the transmission, out of that looseness, and it won't wear correctly. So we got to make that right. Seems to be reading 17 fairly consistently. What I got to do is I got to bring the ring gear a little bit this way to tighten it up. So that means I got to take a shim out of this side, probably a thin shim, they're different thicknesses, and put it into the other side. No, this is where I always get messed up. Let's see, to move the differential that way, I need to take a shim out of this side so it pushes this that way, and put it in this side so that this one gets pushed out that way a little bit. This is why I didn't put the O-rings in. Same thing happened on the MD. Just putting in new bearings always changes things, so you gotta check it. In this left side, I've got 3 shims, and usually they're different thicknesses, but we'll measure. That one's 0.030. That one's the same, 030. That one's 015. I'm going to do the 015, figuring, you know, the difference is kind of doubled because you're swapping it from one side to the other. Is that right? Probably not. That's what I'm going to do. It's not doubled. What the heck am I thinking? I've forgotten my calculus. I'll put this one back in, but I'm not going to tighten it down until I get the other one in because the shims are going to push on the differential differently. Now I'll take this other one off and add the shim I took out to it. I put the bull pinion shaft in the other side to hold up the differential. We'll just add this shim on here. Here's everything together with the shims swapped. I have almost no backlash now. Well, let's set this up and we'll see. That is way too tight. I can just tell by feel. It's too far engaged. I'm lucky if I can get 1 or 2 thousandths off of it. That is worse than being too loose, I think, is being that tight. So I'm going to take this side back apart and measure the shims that we've got on this. We know we swapped out a 15 thousandths, but I suspect what we're going to have to do is take a shim out of the front here and move that shaft back a touch to get tighter engagement, because this overshoots the mark. Let's see what we got here. This is the one that I just swapped over, so it's 15. Yep. And then I got a 30 and a 30, 0.030. So I think we'll put the 15 back on the other side. Now we'll just, double check here. Yeah, we're still at the 17. So we're going to go to plan B here and take a shim out of here to push this shaft back a little bit and increase engagement on the pinion to take up some of that backlash. It's good to have options. We got to take this off, and we got to take this castle nut off. Be good. Just come on, come right out. No, you're not gonna. Just a little tap. Ah. Well, there are the shims. That one's paper thin. It's not good to bend them up. That's what happened. There's 4 shims in here. There are 3. The one that I bent up. Ugh, that stinks. 3, 6, 12, and 30. So let's try taking the 6 out. Those back in. Put this back on. What do you think? Is that better? I don't know. Let's measure. It's better. It's down to 14. But we got to do a little better than that. Remember, it's 10 or 8 to 12 thousandths. I just want to take a little bit more. Maybe we'll take out that paper thin one and see how that does. I took it out, but I can tell you right now there's too much in there. I can feel it. Too much. This one's giving me a run for it. Well, how can you be the same? You're not the same, you're less. But you're still too much. Alright, we're a couple iterations later here because I kept messing with this. And we're right where we need to be now. Between 8 and 10. I wound up taking out the 12, the 6, and the 3 thousandths shims to get us where we needed. There's one other thing we got to do here before we're done with the differential, and that's check the tooth engagement. In the old days, they used to use Prussian blue paint for this, but I used the same white assembly grease, the lubricate, and found that that works just as well. We just paint a thin coat on 3 or 4 teeth here. Then we'll spin this around and run the teeth past the pinion. Remember, you want this going backwards of the way because the bull gears are engaging and driving the other way. So this thing should be looking like it's going in reverse to get the right side of the tooth. We'll bring them back up around here. There we go. Let's take a look. So what you're seeing here is where the teeth made contact with the pinion gear teeth, and it's sort of this area up. So this is called the toe of the ring gear, and this is the heel back here. Now if it were a classic ring gear with straight cut teeth on it, you would see more engagement down here at the toe, and then as the picked up load, remember I spun it under no load, as it picked up load, more of the gear would engage as the metal flexed a little bit. Since this is a spiral cut gear here, you get engagement all along the tooth, and it looks good. The other thing is there's no undercut at the end. Usually on the old straight cut gears you'll have an undercut on this tooth, a little recess, but you don't on these. So if we compare what we see here, you get it up here so it's easier to see, where we've got engagement all along here, and as the tooth comes under more load, it'll pick up more on the heel end here and come down in engagement and here in contact. So it looks good to me. If we compare it, you can always compare it to the wear you see on the teeth from years and years of use, and see how at the toe down here you have a limited engagement. See where it turns from bright to dark, and then as you come back along here you have a fairly even engagement to the heel here where it stops and there's some little black here. And so that's the same thing that we're seeing on these teeth here. We're seeing a kind of slope at the toe and a slope at the heel with a fairly even engagement in between. So we're good there. This job of setting the bevel and ring gear clearance is really important, but I think it's one of the most time consuming, if not the most time consuming and kind of pain in the butt job there is to putting one of these tractors back together. Everything included. But now that I got it set where I need it, I can take things back apart and start putting things together permanently with seals and gaskets and all that kind of stuff. We have to pull the differential back out. And the reason we had to pull the differential out is this top shaft, which is called the spline shaft, has to go in from the back where the differential sits. And I have two new bearings for this. This is the rear bearing. That goes right on here. And this shaft, just like the bottom one, slides in from the back. And using my cheat sheet again, we got to get the gear sets right. This one goes this way, and remember this one had the rivet in it that I removed, so we got to line that up with the right hole in the spline. Holes are right there on top. Then we got this little guy. This faces toward the rear. Then this big guy, and the big end of him goes toward the front. Next, we have a new front bearing here. This one was really bad. The old one was. Make sure it fits. Yep, that's right. Get this seated on here. We have to tap this rear bearing in. Just as an aside, remember I said that this light gray here, this oil slinger gear that's way in the back down there, freewheeled on the shaft that the rest of the gears are on? Well, it's so that when the input shaft is turning, say the tractor's in neutral and this top shaft is spinning but the bottom is not, that oil slinger is still slinging oil and lubricating things. And I think that would be especially important when you're sitting in neutral but you have the PTO or the belt pulley going, because it's still flinging oil up and filling this trough here to feed the PTO back there. So that spins all the time. It doesn't matter if you slide the reverse idler and engage the shaft, it's still spinning. Or if that gear's off, it's still spinning. So you're always getting oil slung around in the transmission and the final drive. Now we can get the input shaft front seal situated and bearing retainer, and we'll start by putting in this new seal here. I just use sockets of the right size to set seals. As long as you're careful, it works all right. Then we have a new gasket here to put on the seal. This is an oil supply and drain hole that leads from the troughs to the transmission. I like Permatex High-Tack for gasket sealer. I know it's old school, but you stick with what works for you, and it's always worked great. You see, this is the oil supply hole coming out of the trough inside, and then this lets oil relieve back inside, so that's what lubricates the bearing in this void here. Got to make sure everything lines up. I'm going to use a little bit of thread sealant on these bolts because they go through holes into the transmission, so it's just a little bit of insurance. Probably doesn't matter that much. Next we have a woodruff key that goes in. I oiled it up a little bit. Then this transmission drive flange, the end of the U-joint here, goes on this key. I lubed it up so that I can get it on the seal without damaging the seal. Just going to take a little bit of persuasion. That's as far as she's going. Now, to keep oil from weeping out around the joint here between the shaft and this fitting, there was a cork gasket that went in here. Unfortunately, I ran out of cork sheet material, but I made a tight fitting gasket out of the usual gaskety stuff. And we're putting that in there with lots of sealer, and that should hold it once it squeezes down. Then we got this washer. This is what holds this top shaft in place, really, is the combination of this and this trapping that bearing in there. Lock it in 2 gears. And we also can't forget while we're up here that this still needs a gasket. Remember, I just put it on temporarily. And it needs a cotter pin to lock this castle nut too. 1 cotter pin. And 1 gasket on 1 cover. My gosh, it's thundering and raining out there. Oh. And our transmission's all set. Feels good. The last thing I got to remember to do, though, and I don't have the right size rivet for it right now, is put this rivet back through here that secures this in place. And I'll have to get one next time I'm out. Now we can reassemble the differential and the bull pinion cages. And if you saw the disassembly video, the O-rings on these bull pinion cages were leaking badly down the case. So these are new O-rings that I'm putting on here. That's what makes the seal to the transmission case. Oil them up real good so they don't get damaged. Oil up this bore that it goes into. Then carefully slide it in without tearing the O-ring. Oh, did you hear that thunder? Wow. That's good. Then install the cage on the other side. You gotta get that O-ring seated. And sometimes getting them seated is not a lot of fun. You're being a little bit difficult. I guess I should have had a talk with you before we started, huh? Let's pull you back out and take a look. There's a chamfer around the edge of this to help get the O-ring started, and I just took the grinder with a wire brush on it and cleaned it up. It had some crud on it, so that should resolve that problem. I'll oil it up. All right. Why won't you start? Well, I guess I'm going to have to go with the nuclear option. I didn't want to, but that's the way it goes. You're just not quite long enough, are you? I need something a little bit longer. Here's one a little bit longer. We're going to draw it down slowly onto the O-ring and make sure that it doesn't get hung up and torn as best as we can. I can see pretty well what it's doing down in there. You just slowly draw it down until it pops in. You're good still. Now we can start setting in these regular bolts. You never know what's going to take up all your time. Oh, I felt it give there. That's good. Yeah, she's in there now. Yep. You know what? Something's been nagging me about this transmission, and that's this gear and this gear right here. And I kept looking at it now and then in between things, and see how that side of that gear isn't worn way down in there like it's been shifted into gear, but this one is. That gear way down there is in backwards. Backwards. It's all got to come apart, get switched around. Ay. I guess the worst thing about it is everything has to come back apart to get to it. It's the first thing in and the last thing out of this case. There's no way around it. One thing's for sure, I'm not taking out that other bull pinion cage that gave me such a hard time getting it in with the O-ring. We're going in this side. Well, looking at the clock, it's about an hour later. I took the whole thing apart again and I put it back together. I guess the fortunate thing is that I caught it now rather than even later when I would have had to take more off. See, this is the way it's supposed to be. See how you've got a worn part here engaging with a worn part here. And the same thing on this sliding gear here. You've got worn and worn engaging. And so neutral on the tractor, which was kind of what keyed me into I had something wrong, it was hard to get in neutral, is, let's see, there, and there. That's neutral. And then reverse is that gear ahead. That's reverse. And then I don't know the other gears, but if you slide them either way, you get different gear ratios. I don't know off the top of my head which is first, second, and third. It's all there though. And the differential feels good. It's just got that nice, no side-to-side play feel. Very little backlash. So finally, I'm, at the end of this. Transmission, differential, bull pinions. And next I can put in the bull gears and then put the axles on, the bearings for the axles. I guess this video is real life. Sometimes you have to backtrack when you do these jobs, and it doesn't really matter how much experience you have. It happens to everyone, I think, although it's easier on YouTube to just edit it out. I remember the saying though, sometimes you eat the bear and sometimes the bear eats you. Well, the bear ate me today, but then I turn around and I guess I ate the bear afterwards because I got it all together right and I'm happy with the way it's come out. But I've got a full video here, so we're going to stop it now, and it's been a long day. I started this work at about 9 and it's 4:45 now. This kind of stuff takes a long time to get set up right, but once you do, you have some confidence in the final product. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time.